After graduation, I went to Peking to teach at Tsinghua. To live in Peking then was to come into contact with authentic Chinese society, to see, as it were, ancient China made manifest. The clear blue sky of Peking, the glorious temples and palaces, and the gay, cheerful, contented working people gave one a feeling of the sufficiency and adequacy of a way of life. Ages had changed, and centuries had passed, and Peking was still there. There the lying Buddha slept in the western hills, the jade fountain hill gave forth crystal-clear springs, and the drum tower intoned the watches of the night. What did man want of God? What more could man ask on earth, having the gift of life? Peking was China, authentic China, with its yellow-roofed palaces and terracotta temple walls and its Mongolian camels and nearness to the Great Wall and the Ming tombs. It was paganism with pagan cheerfulness and content. Now what did being a Christian in China mean? I had been brought up in the protective shell of Christianity. St. John's was a continuation of that shell. We moved in a world of our own, intellectually, and I am sorry to say, aesthetically cut off from the, if you like, heathen community, that satisfying, glorious community, full of wickedness and corruption and poverty, but also of good cheer and content, even of gaiety. To be brought up as a Christian was synonymous with being progressive, Western-minded, and in sympathy with the new learning. It meant, on the whole, acceptance of the West, with particular admiration for the Western microscope and Western surgery. It meant taking a clear, firm stand for education of women and against concubinage and foot binding. Christian women were the first to unbind their feet, and my mother, who had been brought up as a heathen girl, unbound hers and wore socks. It meant an attitude favoring popular mass education and some notion of democracy and speaking English for the better educated. It meant also, in Amoy at least, romanization and ruination of the knowledge of Chinese characters and sometimes ruination of all knowledge of authentic Chinese folklore and folk literature, and the theater. Romanization was a wonderful thing. We in Amoy had a perfect romanization system with 7 tones, which made a mockery of all sinologists' arguments against it. My mother could read the whole Bible in romanization, besides having taught herself to read the hymn book in Chinese characters, and she wrote letters to me in a perfectly clear romanized script. It isn't that romanization is not feasible, but psychologically we don't want it. But there were also disadvantages to a Christian education, which soon became apparent. I had cut myself off not only from Chinese philosophy, but also from Chinese folklore. Not to know Chinese philosophy as such was excusable in a Chinese, but not to know the common ghosts and spirits and folk tales of China was obviously ridiculous. What had happened was that my Christian upbringing was too perfect. There was an element of Calvinism in it. I was not permitted to listen to the age-old beautiful stories sung by the blind minstrels of Changsha to the accompaniment of a guitar. These blind singers, sometimes men but more often women, would go through the streets at night, with a clapper in hand and a lantern, and tell the magic stories and historic romances of China of old. My mother, who had been brought up in a heathen family, told me some of these stories, but I never heard the tales from the minstrel singers themselves. When we boys passed a theatrical show in the square of Kulangsu, we were supposed to look straight past the stage and not to loiter. Now, the stage is the universal medium for educating the Chinese people, both literate and illiterate, in their history. Any Chinese laundryman was better acquainted with the heroes and heroines of the 3 kingdoms than I was. I had known, even in my childhood, that Joshua's trumpets had blown down the walls of Jericho. When I discovered that the tears of Kai Liang's widow, on finding her husband dead as conscript labor to build the Great Wall, had melted away a good section of the Great Wall, my rage was terrible. I had been cheated of my national heritage. That was what a good Puritan Christian education could do to a Chinese boy. I determined to plunge into the great stream of our national consciousness. We lived and moved and had our being in the Christian world. We were sufficient, too. As sufficient as the pagans of Peking. But being a Christian Chinese moving into what I call an authentic Chinese world, with one's eyes and mind open, one was stung with a sense of shame, blushing up to the tips of one's ears. Of what had I not been deprived? Things were not so simple as I had pictured them to be. Even the questions of foot binding and concubinage were not so clear-cut and simple as I had imagined. In fact, I was not to appreciate the ethics and aesthetics of concubinage and foot binding until I heard Ku Hungming's vigorous defense of both. And you will hear much of Ku Hungming before we are through. Here I must mention 2 matters, opium and ancestor worship, which caused a deep sense of injury and of revulsion against the West in the one case, and a sense of being denationalized on the part of a Chinese Christian in the other. The Christians kept away from opium. And of course, the missionaries condemned it. The dramatic part of it, the tragic part of it, was that it was the missionaries' compatriots who brought it in and forced it on us at the point of a gun. It was the great fearless Chinese Mandarin Lin Seishu, of my own illustrious clan, who, as the imperial commissioner of Canton, burned bales of opium on the jetties of Canton and precipitated the war on the opium brought in by the Christians. Lin Seishu had to die in exile in Xinjiang, Chinese Turkestan, after China's defeat in the Opium War, and after the defeat, the open door was thrown wide open. Bales of opium, stacks of them, began to roll in brazenly. But the point is that the missionaries came in the wake of those stinking bales of opium. And then a third item came into the picture. Both the missionary and the opium were under the benevolent protective shadow of the gunboat. The situation became not only deplorable, but comic and downright ridiculous. The missionaries highly disapproved of the merchants, and the merchants highly disapproved of the missionaries, each thinking the others insane. As far as a Chinese could see, the missionaries had taken care to save our souls, so that when the gunboats blew our bodies to bits we were bound to go up to heaven, and that made it quits, of course. As for ancestor worship, it was, now that I look back upon it, so basically a part of being Chinese that, in being forbidden to participate in it, the Chinese Christians virtually excommunicated themselves from the Chinese community and justified the accusation that they were eating foreign religion. The matter was basic and central, and poses the question of how far an unthinking church could go to injure its believers. Ancestor worship is the only visible form of Confucianism as a religion. The worship of Confucius at the Confucian temple was, and had always been, a matter for the scholars and the successful graduates of imperial examinations. But even so, there was no reason for Chinese Christians not to join in it, and no reason whatsoever to cut themselves off from it. For ancestor worship antedated Confucius, as anybody who reads the Chinese classics should know. Confucius was practically doing antediluvian research when he tried to re-establish the evidences of the forms and rules of ancestor worship of the founders of the Chu dynasty some 7 centuries before him, something more remote than Chaucer and a little nearer Beowulf for a modern scholar. Ancestor worship, for the Chinese, is the embodiment of reverence for the past and continuity with the past, and of the strong and deep family system, and therefore of the Chinese motivation for living. It was the basis of all that was good and honorable, and of the desire to go forward, to achieve success in society. Practically, the motivation of Chinese conduct is, do good so that thou mayest be an honor to thy family, and abstain from evil so that thou mayest not be a disgrace to thy ancestors. It is his reason for being a good son, a good brother, a good uncle, and a good citizen. It is the reason for a Chinese being a Chinese. As for the forms of worship, only by the wildest stretch of imagination could they be called idolatry, as the Christian churches called them. Compared with the riot of images in some Christian cathedrals, especially in Italy and in France. These square tablets inscribed with the names of the particular ancestors look almost like the work of some unimaginative, rationalist spirit. There were fewer words on them than on a Christian tombstone. An ancestral temple had an altar behind which stood a collection of such wooden tablets, looking like oversized foot rulers, marked as the seat of the spirits of the different ancestors, men and women. On the altar, at the time of worship, candles and incense were burned. As for kneeling before the tablets at worship, which is the real point of objection of the Christian churches, it was forgotten that Chinese knees were always more flexible than Western knees, and that we often knelt before our parents and grandparents on formal occasions when they were living. The bending of the knees was an act of homage. Confucius said, to gather in the same places where our fathers before us have gathered, to perform the same ceremonies which they before us have performed, to play the same music which they before us have played, to pay respect to those whom they honored, to love those who were dear to them, in fact, to serve those now dead as if they were living, those now departed as if they were still with us. This is the highest achievement of true filial piety. Scratch a Chinaman and you will find an indelible pride in his ancestors. Now, the non-Christians in Amoy were tolerant toward us. There was no social ostracism. The Christian communities in Amoy and Changsha were close-knit like all members of a parish. They were progressive and successful, and their children had better facilities for schooling for both boys and girls. If there was hostility, I think it was in the matter of ancestor worship. We had not been incarcerated. We had incarcerated ourselves and cut ourselves off from the social community. In a modern city, it would not matter very much, but in a village, it could be the most embarrassing personal problem for a Chinese Christian believer. Some Christians had come to my father to ask if they might not, with the best will in the world, contribute to the social fete and the theater on such occasions. What these Christians were really asking was whether they should willfully excommunicate themselves in the eyes of their cousins and uncles and other members of the clan. It was this which the Christian churches forbade, while they cheerily celebrated at home Mother's Day and Father's Day when the parents were living, and if they were dead, with something infinitely nearer to idolatry, actual photographs instead of the tablets which resembled foot rulers. When you drink water, think of its source, says the Chinese proverb. Should Chinese Christians drink only from faucets and stop thinking of the source of the water? When I was a child, I was too young to sense any hostility or to feel the fact that the Chinese Christians had cut themselves off from their own community. Certainly in my school days, we were too happily progressive to sense anything. But I remember some non-Christian leaders in my village who were hostile to the church. The incidents were trivial and amusing. There was none of the violence and hatred which broke out in the national explosion called the Boxer Uprising. The year after my father had completed building the new church, an unsuccessful candidate, an unemployed opium-smoking scholar, decided to solicit contributions to build a Buddhist temple right on the same street, and he did. Poor man. Whether he had a wife who refused to wash his clothes, or whether he determined to look unwashed and spiritual-looking, I could not ascertain. All I can remember is that he had blackened teeth, wore a dirty, half-buttoned gown, and managed to give an eternally unwashed appearance, whether he had the desire to wash or not. I am sure he was reserving the pleasure of a sponge bath for his first day in the Buddhist paradise. And this in spite of the fact that a crystal-clear brook ran right past his temple. But at least the poor man had wit, by which he was making a living. Our church had a bell donated by some Americans, for which a bell tower some 50 feet high had been built at the entrance, and this unemployed scholar consequently had a drum installed at his Buddhist temple, which was most unusual. Buddhist temples also used bells, which he could not afford. When the church bells rang on Sundays, he took care to have his drum sounded also. As he put it, when Jesus clanged, Buddha rolled. We boys, determined not to be outdone, we would take turns to help pull the ropes and listen during the intervals for the drum. We kept the competition going until Father thought we were crazy and stopped us. The following year, after my return from school, the drum was gone. Yellow-toothed man had probably sold it to obtain money for opium. We had won. Another Chinese leader was more respectable because of his age and his beard. He was a kind of alderman for the entire valley. My father got on friendly terms with Grandfather Kim, but Grandfather Kim would not come to the church and would prevent others from coming. Now, the river came down from the mountains, and at a bend where the bridge was, on one side stood the one street of shops of Poe. High on the bank and constantly threatened with erosion, as it received the full impact of the current when a flood came. On the other side was a pebbly beach where the rotating fairs of the region were held once every 5 days. At the foot of the bridge on the beach side was the house of Grandfather Kim, so situated that he could properly be said to own the bridge. The bridge was a wooden affair with rounded logs roughly flattened on top, but with no planks across them. As these logs were not perfectly straight, one could see through to the water below, and women with bound feet had to pick their way carefully so that their heels might not get caught in one of the holes. We knew that the bridge was Grandfather Kim's source of income, for he also smoked opium and needed money to buy it. When there was a big flood, the bridge was either washed away or needed repairs. Every time a flood came, Grandfather Kim would be out collecting money from the villagers for repairs, and a completely washed-away bridge was of course a windfall. Now, autumn floods were fairly frequent in my village, providing a constant source of money for Grandfather Kim. Moreover, by diligent attendance to flaws in the structure, and by seeing to it that the bridge had poorly fitted joints, Grandfather Kim made sure that the bridge was sensitive to the slightest changes in water level, the only requirement being cooperation between Grandfather Kim and Grandfather Heaven. Grandfather Kim, as I remember, was a gentle, reasonable man. The only reason for his hostility to the Christian church was that he ran a gambling den. As my father tried to prevent Christians from gambling, so he had to prevent the gamblers from becoming Christians. There was a natural desire on the part of an intelligent Chinese to join in the national stream of thought of his country and not to be considered a denationalized Chinese. I was a graduate of the best college for English in China, so what? I had a fair grounding in the Confucian classics through my father's personal instruction, and I had memorized, as every educated Chinese was expected to have memorized, the sayings of Confucius in the Analects. It was a necessary part of conversation among educated men, but my calligraphy was horrible, the first sure mark of an uncultivated man in China. My knowledge of Chinese history and poetry and philosophy and literature was full of gaps. Here I was in Peking, the center of the culture of China. I felt like an English student in the first year at Cambridge talking with his Don. The Don smokes at him and rattles off about Swinburne and Keats and A.E. Housman, with whom the student has only a nodding acquaintance. The first thing an intelligent lad would do after such an encounter would be to go to the library and read Swinburne and Keats and A.E. Housman so that he might not appear so boorish and ignorant the next time. That is the normal process of what we call true college education, by the association of minds, or, as one might say, by contagion. I plunged into the study of Chinese literature and philosophy with a sense of shame. The vast world of pagan wisdom opened before me, and the process of true postgraduate education, the process of unlearning, began. This process was to include jumping the limits of Christian beliefs. Outwardly, I was a success as a teacher. I got on well at Tsinghua, which had been founded with the money refunded from the American portion of the Boxer indemnity. The college was rapidly coming to the fore as one of the most modern and best equipped in China, and it was beginning to build a magnificent library. It had a marvelous Chinese college president and a good Chinese and American staff, and it was situated in what was formerly a Manchu prince's garden outside Peking. But mentally, I was awkward and ill-adjusted. To this day, I am still sometimes amiably referred to by Dr. who she see below as a Puritan. I was a Puritan. I do not have the suavity and good camaraderie expected of a non-Christian Chinese poet or scholar. By constitution, I cannot drink. Wine dries up my eyelids. As for the pipe of tobacco, I would defend to eternity this reliable comforter of the spirit. Although I called myself a pagan, such a thing as the feast of Bacchus remained outside my power of comprehension, and still does. At a drinking feast of Roman captains, reclining on couches and eating bunches of grapes served on gold platters, I would forever remain an observer. As for women, there was something good in a Puritan education, in discipline. While some of my colleagues went whoring on Sundays, I conducted a Sunday school in Tsinghua, which was a non-Christian college. A fellow professor called me a virgin, which I was till my marriage. That is why I love so much the nude shows of Parisian nightclubs. No one can properly appreciate nude shows so well as a good Puritan. I was never suave and confident like the rich men's sons at college, and although in later years I learned to be at home in the society of men and women, I still could not learn to slap a fellow violently on the back. That is, I think, because the spirit of the high mountains has never left me, and I am essentially a boy from the country, which the words pagan and heathen etymologically mean. Even today, I still enjoy walking about in my socks over the carpets in my apartment as one of the greatest luxuries of life. I think that human feet as God made them for walking are perfect. There can be no improvement upon them, and wearing shoes is a form of human degeneracy. Thomas Wolfe has written rather intimately in Look Homeward, Angel, about the warping of his toes as he grew up. Sometimes, while walking in the streets of Manhattan at night, I scandalized my wife by letting out a loud yawn or a sudden deliberate and prolonged scream. I was liberating myself, for though I walked upon the cement sidewalks of Manhattan, mine eyes still saw the untrammeled spaces of mountain peaks, and mine ears still heard the sweet laughter and chatter of the mountain streams, and I was unafraid. I have often wondered what it is like to be born a rich man's son, to be suave, and to know when to keep one's mouth shut, calmly waiting to be promoted as an official. For in China, to be a scholar was to become a member of the ruling class. I have seen a colleague of mine who came from an official family. His origin and his undoubted destiny were officialdom, but I am from Fujian, not from Shanghai or Peking. We produced poets, scholars, and beauties, but no first-rank statesmen in all China's history. During the short period when I was in the foreign ministry, I saw this colleague who had learned to keep his mouth shut and who was polite to everyone and suave and imperturbable. He spent his time in his office drinking tea and reading newspapers. I said to myself, this man will surely one day become a provincial governor. Actually, he did. I have often wondered profoundly at this mystery of the relation between the unspeakable charm of keeping a closed mouth and official careerism, and I have come to the conclusion that while a soldier gives his blood for his country but never gives up his honor, a real, successful politician gives up his honor for his country but never gives his blood. A soldier's duty is but to do and die. A good politician's is just to do and never talk about it. All he does is love his country. 3 great Chinese writers of the past generation came from Fujian: Yen Fu, translator of Adam Smith; Montesquieu and Thomas Huxley; Lin Shu, translator of Scott and Dickens, whom I have mentioned, and Ku Hungming see below. My brief theological studies had shaken my belief in the dogmas. One of the professors tried to convince me of the theoretical necessity of the Holy Ghost by saying that if there were A and B, there must be a connecting line C between the two. This arrogance of the scholastic method, plus the dogmatic spirit, hurt my inner consciousness. These dogmas were produced by scholastic minds, treating spiritual things as material things, and even equating God's justice with man's justice. The theologians were so sure of themselves, they wanted their conclusions accepted as final, sealed, and encased for all eternity. Of course, I rebelled. Many of the dogmas were irrelevant and obscured the truth of Christ. By a codifying process, Paul knew more than Peter, and the church fathers of the 4th century knew more than Paul. By comparison of their teachings, Jesus knew least of all. I had lost the certainty of belief, while still clinging tenaciously to the belief in the fatherhood of God. Conducting the Sunday school class at Tsinghua at Christmas, I already had great difficulty in visualizing just how the stars could guide the Magi to the exact street of the stable. And I enjoyed the beauty of the symbolism of angels singing upon the midnight clear in the Santayana sense only. Santa Claus was a disenchanted myth, but still a beautiful myth. Nevertheless, something had to happen before I could cut myself off from the Christian church. At Peking, I came into contact with 2 first-class minds which left an indelible influence upon me and which, in different ways, contributed to my further development. One was Dr. Hu Shi, whose name spells the Chinese literary renaissance of 1917. The literary renaissance was strictly speaking anti-Confucianist, among other more important things. Dr. Hu Shi, then a postgraduate student of Columbia, had fired the first shot from New York, a shot which changed the entire tenor of Chinese thinking and Chinese literature of our generation. This was the literary revolution, a historical landmark in Chinese literature, advocating the change from the classical language to the vernacular as the normal medium of literary expression. Meanwhile, the organ La Jeunesse was being edited by Chen Tuxiu, a communist professor at Peking National University. Hu Shi returned with national acclaim to join Peking University, and I was at Tsinghua to greet him. It was an electrifying experience. I felt instinctive sympathy for the whole progressive attitude of the movement. The greats of contemporary China were there: Liang Kai-keo, Tsai Yunpei, and Lin Changmin. Then came Paul Monroe and John Dewey on the invitation of Peking University before I left abroad for study. Mao Zedong was there as a librarian when I returned from Germany to join the Peking National University in 1923, but no one took any notice of him, and I never saw him. All in all, the literary renaissance was a liberating force, a true resolve on the part of intellectual Chinese to make a complete break with the past. While the warlords were fighting, intellectual China was in the grip of its own challenges and controversies. Peking was life. Lin Shu, the great translator whom my sister had read, was also at the Peking University, and he damned the vernacular tongue as the language of rickshaw pullers and peddlers. There was controversy, and there was life, provocative of thought and of study. There was a cause to fight for or against. Young China was shaken to its foundations. Chen Tuxiu, the communist, continued to damn the whole Confucian system in general and the Confucian worship of chastity and widowhood in particular, while Hu Shi, a typical rationalist, grounded in the scientific method of research, was actually more moderate and wrote like a scholar. Chen condemned and denounced other superstitions, like the Chinese planchette in which the mediums wrote out scholarly verse. Of course, the literary organ also took foot-binding in its stride, although it was a somewhat belated effort. We were already living in Republican days. A zealous student wrote, "You all ought to bear the responsibility for all China's women's small feet upon our shoulders." Certainly an unusual task for the new champions of liberty, considering the fact that there were at least 50 million small feet of Chinese women to carry, and that this young man might have weak knees. Inevitably, I gravitated toward the Peking National University, which I joined later, after my return from abroad. In the midst of this general umwälzung, or upheaval, I plunged into the study, for my own salvation, of Chinese philosophy and philology, everything I could lay my hands on. I swam, and how I swam, in that vigorous current of Chinese awakening. There was a man, however, who did not join the hue and cry. He had returned from the universities of Berlin and Edinburgh and Oxford in the year 1885, and was therefore a generation above me. For him, we, the young upstarts of the Republican days, were ignoramuses and cads, if not sneaks, who had been corrupted by the modern mob worship, pleasantly called democracy, tarnished souls all, or as he put it, the modern clueless, up-to-date Chinamen, the returned students, who had learned from the people of Europe and America not to behave themselves but to misbehave themselves. He was a crank but not a bore, for his was a first-class mind, and he had, above all, insight and depth, as no man in my generation had. No man in China wrote English the way he did, because of his challenging ideas and because of his masterly style, a style reminiscent of Matthew Arnold's poised and orderly evolution of ideas and repetition of certain phrases, plus the dramatic bombast of Thomas Carlyle and the witticisms of Heine. This man's name was Ku Hungming. Ku Hungming was a son of Amoy. Ku acted like a glass of claret before one tackled the feast of Chinese humanism. He played a critical role in the direction of my beliefs by turning everything upside down. I cannot do better than quote Somerset Maugham's description of him. Maugham never mentioned Ku Hungming's name, but used the phrase, the philosopher, in his book on a Chinese screen. Maugham saw him in Sichuan, above the Yangtze Gorges, probably in 1921. Here is a vivid description, very much to the point as revealing the man's character, and here lived a philosopher of repute, the desire to see whom had been to me one of the incentives of a somewhat arduous journey. He was the greatest authority in China on the Confucian learning. He was said to speak English and German with facility. He had been for many years secretary to one of the Empress Dowager's greatest viceroys, but he lived now in retirement, on certain days in the week. However, all through the year he opened his doors to such as sought after knowledge and discoursed on the teaching of Confucius. He had a body of disciples, but it was small, since the students for the most part preferred to his modest dwelling and his severe exaltations the sumptuous buildings of the foreign university and the useful science of the barbarians. With him, this was mentioned only to be scornfully dismissed. From all I heard of him, I concluded that he was a man of character. When I announced my wish to meet this distinguished gentleman, my host immediately offered to arrange a meeting, but the days passed and nothing happened. I made inquiries, and my host shrugged his shoulders. I sent him a chit and told him to come along, he said. I don't know why he hasn't turned up. He's a cross-grained old fellow. I did not think it was proper to approach a philosopher in so cavalier a fashion, and I was hardly surprised that he had ignored a summons such as this. I caused a letter to be sent asking in the politest terms I could devise whether he would allow me to call upon him, and within 2 hours received an answer making an appointment for the following morning at 10 o'clock. The philosopher entered. I hastened to express my sense of the honor he did me in allowing me to visit him. He waved me to a chair and poured out the tea. I am flattered that you wish to see me, he returned. Your countrymen deal only with coolies and with compradors. They think every Chinese must be one or the other. I ventured to protest, but I had not caught his point. He leaned back in his chair and looked at me with an expression of mockery. They think they have but to beckon, and we must come. I saw then that my friend's unfortunate communications still rankled. I did not quite know how to reply. I murmured something complimentary. He was an old man, tall, with a thin grey queue and bright large eyes under which were heavy bags. His teeth were broken and discolored. He was exceedingly thin, and his hands, fine and small, were withered and claw-like. I had been told that he was an opium smoker. He was very shabbily dressed in a black gown, a little black cap, both much the worse for wear, and dark grey trousers gartered at the ankle. He was watching. He did not quite know what attitude to take up, and he had the manner of a man who was on his guard. Presently I was conscious of a certain relaxation in his demeanor. He was like a man who was all set and rigid to have his photograph taken, but hearing the shutter click lets himself go and eases into his natural self. He showed me his books. I took the Ph.D. in Berlin, you know, he said, and afterward I studied for some time in Oxford. But the English, if you will allow me to say so, have no great aptitude for philosophy. Though he put the remark apologetically, it was evident that he was not displeased to say a slightly disagreeable thing. We have had philosophers who have not been without influence in the world of thought, I suggested. Hume and Berkeley. The philosophers who taught at Oxford when I was there were anxious not to offend their theological colleagues. They would not follow their thought to its logical consequences in case they should jeopardize their position in university society. Have you studied the modern developments of philosophy in America? I asked. Are you speaking of pragmatism? It is the last refuge of those who want to believe the incredible. I have more use for American petroleum than for American philosophy. And so on, with more of this tartness, I think Moham's characterization is just. I have sworn not to use the favorite cliché of the critics, the word perceptive, but his study of Western philosophy had only served in the end to satisfy him that wisdom, after all, was to be found within the limits of the Confucian canon. Once my friend saw him at the Chengquang Cinema Theatre, and in front of Ku sat a bald-headed Scotsman. Now, a white man is usually treated with great respect throughout China, but Ku Hongming made a point of insulting a white man to show that the Chinese were superior. He wanted to light a foot-long Chinese pipe and had run out of matches. When he spotted the Scotsman in front of him, he lightly tapped the Scot's bald head with his pipe, and with outstretched, tapering fingers, said calmly, "Light, please." Scotsman was so taken aback that he obliged in the most Christian manner. Perhaps Ku is best known among the Chinese for his witty defense of concubinage. "You have seen a teapot with 4 teacups," he said. "But have you ever seen a teacup with 4 teapots?" It was also said among us that if you wanted to see Ku Hongming, the way was not to go to his house, but to look for him in the Para Yutang red light district. This was not the pose of an old Raoé. It was a philosophic conviction of some importance. He urged the ignorant Westerners to go to the Para Yutang district if they wanted to study the true Chinese culture and civilization, and witness for themselves the essential decency, modesty, and virtue of Chinese womanhood in the person of the sing-song girls. And Ku was not far wrong, for the sing-song artists, like the geishas of Japan, could still blush, whereas the modern college girl had ceased to do so. Ku Hongming had acted as Governor Chang Chitung's secretary-interpreter. Chang Chitung was himself one of the great reformist mandarins toward the end of the 19th century and played an important role in keeping the Boxer uprising out of the Yangtze Valley. I saw Ku, with very thin hair, walking alone in the Central Park. One might have taken him for a eunuch fallen upon bad days or not noticed him at all. What pride of isolation, however. I did not feel equal to approaching this expert on Matthew Arnold and Ruskin and Emerson and Goethe and Schiller. And this, in spite of the fact that I had admired him from a great distance in my college days, when Eugene Chen, later foreign minister of the nationalist government in 1928, and Ku Hongming were exchanging blows in the Peking Gazette, an English daily edited by Chen, in 1915. Ku was a confirmed royalist and a proud supporter of a lost cause, and Chen a Republican. Both were past masters of the diatribe and perfectly at home in English. Chen called Ku a mountebank and a scribe, and Ku called Chen a jackal and a babu, a denationalized, half-anglicized Hindu, for Chen, born in Trinidad, spoke Chinese like a foreigner. When I was studying in Germany, which was just after the close of the First Great War, I found that Ku Hongming was quite well known in certain circles in that country. His booklet Verdedigung China's Zhejian Europa, so far as I can remember, a German translation of his book The Spirit of the Chinese Civilization, was well known among cultured circles. The book was written in 1915, shortly after the outbreak of the Great War, and although he castigated Prussian militarism in no uncertain terms, he placed the first blame for the war on the bastard British imperialism and the Cockney mob worship. He had kind things to say for the German intense love of righteousness, for order and tidiness, Zucht und Ordnung, and for their moral fiber. At home in Goethe and Schiller, and a great admirer of Frederick the Great and Prince Bismarck, his words have had a good hearing in Germany, although he is totally unknown in the United States. Ku Hongming was strong meat and not for weak stomachs, and for Westerners especially his writings are as full of bristles as a porcupine. But he had depth and insight, which excuse many sins, for the quality of true insight is rare. Not the least of his services was his translation of 3 of the Confucian 4 books. It was more than a faithful translation. It was an act of creative interpretation, a sudden transfusion of light of the old texts through a deep philosophic understanding. He acted, in fact, as the galvanizer of ideas Eastern and Western. His discourses and sayings of Confucius was studded with illuminating remarks from Goethe, Schiller, Ruskin, and Joubert. His translations of the Confucian books were good because the originals were well understood. Chinese classics had never been well translated. The sinologues did a poor job of it, and the Chinese themselves had neglected it. The translation from Chinese into English was so difficult. The ideas were so different, and what was worse, the modes of thought were so different, and what was still worse, grammatical relations were expressed solely by syntax in Chinese, without inflections, and without the usual connectives and articles, and sometimes without the subject of predicate. Thus the very sources of Chinese philosophy were, and still are very much today, clothed in a twilight of hazy likenesses. The result is that Herbert A. Giles, the late professor of Chinese at Cambridge, was able to express his opinion that Confucius was perhaps only a dull, humdrum, platitudinous village schoolmaster. The pitfalls in the translation of philosophic ideas are very great. The very concepts for Ren, benevolence, mercy, humanity, manhood, for ye justice, right, righteousness, for lie, ritualism, courtesy, good form, social order, have not been even understood. In this connection, I may perhaps be excused for giving an example of cumbersome circumlocution which passes for translation. This is from James Legge, whose translations of the Confucian classics have been incorporated in the Sacred Books of the Far East, edited by Max Mueller. Legge made a fetish of literalness, as if a certain air of foreign remoteness, rather than clarity, were the mark of fidelity. What Mencius said was this, in exactly 12 words in Chinese, that when armies were lined up with spears and shields to attack a city, the weather is less important than the terrain, and the terrain less important than the army morale. More literally, if one preferred, sky times not so good as ground situation not so good as human harmony. To any Chinese child, sky times simply means the weather and can mean nothing else. Ground situation means the terrain, and human harmony means the army morale. But according to Legge, Mencius said, opportunities of time, vouchsafed by heaven, are not equal to advantages of situation, afforded by the earth. And advantages of situation, afforded by the earth, are not equal to the union arising from the accord of men. Ku Hongming's translations will forever stand, for they have that happy matching of sense and expression that can come only through the mastery of both languages and understanding of their deeper meanings. Ku's translations are veritable revelations. Nurtured on Matthew Arnold, Carlyle, Ruskin, Emerson, Goethe, and Schiller, Ku thought he comprehended Confucianism as no other man ever did before him. His central idea turned around the question of culture and vulgarity. Culture meant the Confucian idea of the gentleman, and vulgarity, in Ruskin's terms, was simply a dead callousness of the body and the soul, and a want of sensation. What put teeth into all his discussion of culture and anarchy was the spectacle of white imperialism fighting to grab China's territory, while its apostles, including certainly some Christian missionaries, pontificated about the heathen Chinese and about their civilizing mission to educate them, especially after the Boxer Uprising, when the open robbery of China's territory in the name of the open door was accompanied by what he called the unbearable British cant about civilization, and when the white man added insult to injury by abusing Him, the Empress Dowager, in the North China Daily News, Ku was enormously nettled. He lashed out at what he called the bastard British imperialism, catering to the Cockney instinct of trade and money-grabbing and worship of the mob, and the man-eating colonial politic of the Kaiser, and the combination of the cad and the sneak, whose own souls were very much in need of salvation. It was nationalism with a sting and a vengeance in it, plus a royalist, anti-democratic bias with an ideal of kingliness, such as that represented by Frederick the Great. Carlyle's influence. For Ku Hongming, the Boxer Uprising was the voice of the people, and it was in his Papers from a Viceroy's Yemen, published in 1901, in the wake of the confusion, that he was at his most caustic and astringent. The plain fact was, of course, that the Boxer Uprising was precipitated by the unholy trinity of missionary, opium, and gunboat. It must be remembered that for the murder of one missionary, China had to pay Kaiser Wilhelm with the port of Tsingtao and the railway rights of the entire province of Shantung. White imperialism was rampant, and when the very integrity of China was at stake, Ku Hongming flayed and lashed out with all his strength, and all but sank his teeth into the flesh of the British religion of mob worship and of the Kaiser's colonial politic. He wrote Defensio Populi ad Populos, or the modern missionaries considered in relation to the recent riots. His voice cried to high heaven. The papers from a viceroy's Yemen contained, as the longest paper, the latter-day notes on the Chinese question, originally published in the Japan Mail in Yokohama, which proved to be a historical examination of culture and its degeneration in England, France, Germany, and the United States. His voice was strident. He had no geniality in his soul, but the wine of his sarcasm was strong. This is the tone of light mockery of the Englishman in China. After Lord Beaconsfield's death, the British aristocracy again became helpless, and their doyen, Lord Salisbury, met a Birmingham lad with a Cockney intellect. This Birmingham Cockney has been trying to toady to the pride of the British aristocracy by copying the flag of Lord Beaconsfield's imperialism and waving it aloft for the self-assertion of the Anglo-Saxon race. Really, were it not so tragic, the picture of the fine old British aristocracy, now hard up for money as well as in ideals and ideas, being led by a small Birmingham Cockney lad with his imperial rag of Anglo-Saxon self-assertion, would be as comical as the picture of the Scotch penniless lass with a Lang pedigree. Asterisk this and the following quotations are from papers from a viceroy's Yemen, Kelly and Walsh, Shanghai, 1901. After Frederick. Germany is Prussia. Germany is the Scotland of Europe. The Prussian is the lowland Scot who, living in a flat country, is devoid of imagination. Moreover, the climate in Prussia is much more severe. Therefore, the Prussian, besides want of imagination, has a terrible appetite. In our family, says Prince Bismarck, we are all great eaters, Lord of Stark-Esser. If many had such an appetite capacitet, like us, why, the nation would not be able to exist. I would have to emigrate. Frederick had no imagination, but he had, besides genius, the French culture, l'esprit, the quick movement of mind and lucidity of the French culture. After Frederick, the Prussian Puritan, for want of imagination, could not continue the Lord Protectorate over Germany. Therefore, Napoleon had to come back with the glorious restoration at Jena. Emerson, with great insight, has remarked that what sent Napoleon to St. Helena was not loss of battles, but the vulgarity, the bourgeois, the cockney in him. All the cultivated gentlemen of Europe hailed Napoleon when he came as the bringer of the great liberal ideas of the Revolution. But when they found out that the Corsican bourgeois only wanted to found a dynasty, all the gentlemen of Europe were disgusted. Then the Prussian Puritan in the uniform of Marshal Vorwärts arose and joined the gentlemen of Europe in their chase of the Corsican bourgeois. When Marshal Vorwärts chased Napoleon out of Germany, he wanted to chase also the great liberal ideas of the French Revolution. Against this, the whole of intellectual Germany rose to fight him. That was the beginning of the Kulturkampf. The true great liberal ideas of the French Revolution are for open door, carrière ouverte aux talents in politics, and for expansion in religion. The inclination to selfishness of the lowland Scot in Marshal Vorwärts made him dislike the open door, and the want of imagination of the Prussian Puritan hindered him from understanding what expansion means in religion. And so on and on Ku Hungming rattles. He skips and romps through the grounds of modern European history, and he arrives at the remarkable conclusion that the real anarchy of the world today is not in China, although the Chinese are suffering from its effects, but in Europe and America. And he cried out to the people of Europe, Seid zu, Volker Europas, Waret Eure Heiligsten Götter, look out, people of Europe, look after your holy cultural values. In respect to true Christianity, Ku Hungming did not attack the teachings of Jesus Christ, but he vehemently attacked the active cooperation of the Jesuits with the French army and that of the German bishops with the German army during the Boxer Rebellion. Here is an example of his bitterness. Christianity was formerly a power that kept down the selfishness of the lowland Scot and the terrible appetite of the Pomeranian great eater in the German nation. But now Christianity in Germany is as dead as the dodo. In its place, they have officially set up the Christianity of Bishop Answer, of Kaiachau fame, or perhaps of that National Socialist and political person who thus writes in the last number of the Zukunft on the no-pardon speech of the German Kaiser, "What are we to do with 50,000 Chinamen who surrender? To feed them won't do. Therefore, when we meet with 50,000 caterpillars, what are we to do? Crush them with a roller. Disgusting business. But it cannot be helped. We do not know how Jesus might have spoken if he had lived not in a world of peace, but of wars. Jesus Christ, too, according to this parson, would become a carnivorous animal, and this is what he said about the true Christian and true Christianity. Quoting Confucius, he says, "It is what you are, that is your religion. It is not your religion which makes you what you are. Be unselfish and merciful then, no matter whether you are a Jew, Chinese or German, a merchant, missionary, soldier, diplomat or coolie, you are a Christian, a civilized man. But be selfish, be unmerciful, then you are a sneak, a cad, a philister, a heathen, and a malachite, a savage, a beast, even if you are the emperor of the world." Then he went on to quote Goethe's conception of Christianity, of progress, and of civilization in Dichtung und Wahrheit as consisting in mercy and considerateness, and being human even to the inhuman. It will have yet to be seen whether Europe and America, in dealing with the Chinese problem, will adopt Goethe's conception of civilization or that of the German political person who, with his steamroller, wants to make Jesus Christ a carnivorous animal. The true Christian is one who is a Christian because it is his nature to be so, because he loves holiness and all that is lovable in Christianity. That is the true Christian. The sneak Christian is one who wants to be a Christian because he is afraid of hellfire. The cad Christian is one who wants to be a Christian because he wishes to go to heaven to drink tea and sing hymns with the angels. Now, the true Jesuit is one who does not very much believe in heaven, angels or hellfire, but he wants other people to believe in these things, to be a Christian for his benefit. That is the Jesuit. Such reading was strong wine which easily went to the head of a young Chinese reader. It was good reading, but also reading with a peculiar soul-provoking quality, for one about to ask what was the essence of Christianity and what was, after all, Confucianism. So, relaxed and amused, one could sit back and read more comfortably his rather extraordinary criticism of the different nations. The American people, I may be permitted to say here, find it difficult to understand the real Chinaman and the Chinese civilization, because the American people, as a rule, are broad, simple, but not deep. The English cannot understand the real Chinaman and the Chinese civilization because the English, as a rule, are deep, simple, but not broad. The Germans, again, cannot understand the real Chinaman and the Chinese civilization because the Germans, especially the educated Germans, as a rule, are deep, broad, but not simple. The French, well, the French are the people, it seems to me, who can understand and have understood the real Chinaman and the Chinese civilization best, because the French people have to a preeminent degree a quality of mind, such as all the people I have mentioned above as a rule have not, a quality of mind which, above all things, is necessary in order to understand the real Chinaman and the Chinese civilization, a quality of mind, namely delicacy. It will be seen from what I have said above that the American people, if they will study the Chinese civilization, will get depth, the English, broadness, the Germans, simplicity, and all of them, Americans, English and Germans, by the study of the Chinese civilization, of Chinese books and literature, will get a quality of mind which, I take the liberty of saying here that it seems to me, they all of them, as a rule, have not to a preeminent degree, namely delicacy. From the preface to the Spirit of the Chinese Civilization, published in Peking, 1915, it was all very comfortable and very soothing. I dispute the point that the Chinese had breadth or broadness, although simplicity and delicacy and depth they certainly have. But one was stimulated by such reading to rediscover one's own country, and to make a journey of exploration through the obscure, luxuriant jungle of Chinese thought, and try to arrive at some kind of understanding.